Step away from the first-class line. This area is for legitimate passengers only. Linda Rodriguez didn't whisper those words. She announced them loud enough for half of Gate B14 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport to turn and stare. Her voice cut through the ambient noise of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements like a blade through silk. Dr. Camille Brooks, standing calmly with her boarding pass in hand, felt every eye in the terminal land on her. At 2:47 p.m. on a scorching Texas afternoon in late September, those words would spark a chain of events that would end careers, reshape an airline, and remind everyone present that assumptions can be devastatingly expensive. But in exactly 18 minutes, the woman behind that gate counter would discover she had just humiliated the former professor of the man who owned the airline. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of how they look, hit that subscribe button. This story will show you why respect costs nothing but its absence can cost everything. Camille stood perfectly still, her dark eyes meeting Linda's hostile glare with the kind of calm that comes from facing prejudice so many times you develop immunity to its sting. She was 42 years old, dressed in a simple navy blazer over a white silk blouse and black slacks. Nothing flashy, nothing demanding attention. She carried a sleek leather briefcase and a small rolling carry-on. To any reasonable observer, she looked exactly like what she was, a successful professional traveling on business. But Linda Rodriguez saw something different. She saw a black woman in the first-class line, and her brain immediately began making calculations that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with bias. "Did you hear me?" Linda's voice rose another notch. "I need you to step back." A businessman in an expensive suit behind Camille shifted uncomfortably. A young mother juggling a toddler and a diaper bag looked up from her phone. An elderly couple in matching Hawaiian shirts stopped their quiet conversation. The gate area, which moments before had hummed with the routine chaos of air travel, began to focus on a single point of tension. Camille didn't move. She had learned long ago that retreat in the face of prejudice only emboldened it. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it up so Linda could see it clearly. "I have a valid first-class ticket," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in lecture halls and boardrooms. "Flight 847 to Seattle. Seat 2A. Linda's eyes narrowed. She stepped out from behind the gate counter, her Skybridge Airlines uniform crisp, and pressed her name tag gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Behind her, Sofia Delgado, a younger gate agent, watched the interaction with growing discomfort. "Anyone can print a boarding pass," Linda said, her tone dripping with suspicion. "I need to see your ID and proof of payment." The request was outrageous. Gate agents didn't demand proof of payment, especially for tickets booked by third parties. It was a clear violation of company protocol, designed for one purpose: to humiliate and intimidate. But Camille had been playing this game for too long to be rattled by amateur tactics. She had faced down venture capitalists who questioned her expertise, academic peers who doubted her research, and corporate executives who assumed she was in the wrong room. A power-tripping gate agent was hardly her biggest challenge of the week. "Here's my ID," she said, producing her driver's license with the same calm precision. As for payment, this ticket was purchased by the International Aviation Innovation Summit. I'm their keynote speaker. Linda took the ID, studying it like she was examining a counterfeit bill. Around them, more passengers were beginning to notice the interaction. Phones were discreetly being pulled from pockets. The modern instinct to document injustice was kicking in. "Dr. Camille Brooks." Linda read aloud, drawing out the title with a syrupy, mocking tone. "Aerospace materials scientist." She looked up from the license, her expression suggesting she found the credentials as believable as a unicorn sighting. "That's correct," Camille replied. her voice steady despite the heat building in her chest. Linda handed the ID back with theatrical reluctance. "Well, Dr. Brooks," she said, the title dripping with sarcasm, "we'll just have to verify your story." What Linda Rodriguez couldn't know, was that the woman standing in front of her had revolutionized the aerospace industry. Dr. Camille Brooks wasn't just any scientist. She was the doctor. Camille Brooks, the brilliant mind behind the carbon fiber composite materials that had made modern aircraft 30% more fuel efficient and 50% lighter than their predecessors. 15 years earlier, she had been Professor Brooks at MIT, teaching advanced materials science to some of the brightest minds in engineering. Her classroom had been a crucible of innovation where theoretical physics met practical application, where dreams of flight were forged into reality. She had been tough, demanding, brilliant, and inspiring in equal measure. Her students either rose to meet her standards or switched majors. One of her students, an eager young man named Jonathan Mitchell, had not only met her standards but exceeded them. She had pushed him harder than most, seeing in him a rare combination of technical brilliance and business acumen. She had guided his thesis on lightweight alloy composites, challenged his assumptions, and shaped his thinking about leadership and innovation. When he graduated summa cum laude, she had been genuinely proud. She had lost track of him over the years, as professors do with students who go on to change the world. If she had been keeping track, she would have known that Jonathan Mitchell was now the CEO of Skybridge Airlines, one of the fastest-growing carriers in the United States. She would have known that her former student had built his company's reputation on innovation efficiency and customer service. She would have known that he credited much of his success to the critical thinking skills she had drilled into him in her materials science lab. But Camille had been too busy changing her own world to follow the career trajectories of former students. After leaving MIT, she had founded Brooks Lab, a private research company that contracted with aerospace manufacturers worldwide. Her patents on ceramic matrix composites were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Her consulting fees commanded 6 figures for a single project. Major airlines flew her around the world first class as a matter of course, eager for her expertise on everything from engine efficiency to structural integrity. Today's trip to Seattle was routine by her standards, but extraordinary by any other measure. She was the opening keynote speaker at the International Aviation Innovation Summit, the most prestigious gathering of aerospace minds in the world. Her presentation on next-generation materials would be attended by CEOs, military leaders, and government officials from 6 continents. The conference organizers had booked her the first-class ticket, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. They needed her rested and ready to deliver insights that could shape the future of flight. She had dressed deliberately understated for travel, choosing comfort and professionalism over flash. Her blazer was well-tailored but not obviously expensive. Her briefcase was quality leather but bore no designer logos. She wore a simple watch and no jewelry beyond small pearl earrings. She had learned over the years that drawing attention in airports often led to unwanted complications, especially for a black woman traveling alone. But apparently even her careful choices in presentation couldn't protect her from the assumptions of a gate agent who had decided that first class was not where she belonged. Camille glanced at her watch. Boarding was scheduled to begin in 6 minutes. She needed to be on that plane. The summit's opening ceremony was tomorrow morning, and her presentation was at 9 a.m. sharp. Hundreds of people were counting on her to be there. Behind Linda, Sofia Delgado continued to watch the interaction with growing alarm. Sofia had been working for Skybridge for 3 years, long enough to recognize when a situation was spiraling out of control. She had processed Dr. Brooks' boarding pass earlier during the pre-boarding check. The ticket was legitimate, the seat assignment was valid, and the passenger had been polite and professional. There was absolutely no reason for this confrontation. But Linda was her supervisor, and challenging a supervisor in front of passengers was a career-limiting move. Sophia found herself trapped between doing the right thing and keeping her job, a position that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. The gate area was filling up now as boarding time approached. Business travelers checked their phones impatiently. Families gathered their scattered belongings. Flight attendants wheeled their luggage toward the jetway. The normal pre-boarding ritual was unfolding around the growing tension at the gate counter. Michael Thompson, a technology consultant from Austin, noticed the commotion and discreetly pulled out his phone. He had 50,000 followers on social media and a keen sense for content that would resonate. Something about the body language of this interaction told him he was witnessing something that needed to be documented. "Folks," he whispered into his phone as he began live streaming, "I'm at DFW Airport right now, and there's a situation developing at Gate B14. A professional black woman is being harassed by a gate agent for no apparent reason. This is the kind of thing we need to be paying attention to." Linda Rodriguez had been having a bad day even before Dr. Brooks appeared in her line of sight. Her shift supervisor had written her up for excessive break times. A passenger earlier had complained about her attitude to corporate headquarters. Her boyfriend had texted that morning to say he was moving out. She was looking for someone to take her frustrations out on, and Dr. Brooks had presented herself at exactly the wrong moment. But beyond personal frustrations, Linda operated under a set of assumptions about who belonged where in the hierarchy of air travel. In her mind, first class was the domain of white businessmen in expensive suits, celebrities with obvious entourages, or elderly wealthy couples taking luxury vacations. A black woman traveling alone, no matter how professional her appearance, simply didn't fit the template she carried in her head. These assumptions weren't conscious or deliberate. They were the result of hundreds of small interactions, media representations, and cultural messages that had accumulated over her 38 years of life. She would have denied being racist if asked directly. She would have pointed to black friends, to her Hispanic heritage, to her own experiences with discrimination. But bias doesn't require conscious hatred. It only requires the absence of conscious examination. Dr. Brooks represented a cognitive dissonance that Linda's brain struggled to process. Rather than examining her assumptions, Linda chose to question the reality in front of her. It was easier to believe that this woman was trying to scam her way into first class than to accept that her mental models might be incomplete. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify this ticket," Linda announced, her voice carrying across the gate area like a public declaration. More heads turned. More phones emerged from pockets. The atmosphere in the gate area shifted from routine travel stress to focused attention on an unfolding drama. Camille felt the weight of those stares, the familiar heat of being made into a spectacle. She had given presentations to audiences of thousands, had defended her research before panels of skeptical peers, had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with some of the toughest executives in the industry. But there was something uniquely degrading about being questioned and doubted in front of random strangers who would now forever associate her face with suspicion and trouble. "The ticket has already been verified," she said, her voice remaining level despite the growing anger in her chest. "Your colleague processed it during pre-boarding check-in." Linda shot a sharp look at Sophia, who immediately found something urgent to examine on her computer screen. "That was preliminary," Linda said, turning back to Camille. "I need to do a full verification." She began typing aggressively on her terminal, her fingers stabbing at the keys like she was trying to punch holes through the keyboard. The gate area grew quieter as more passengers tuned in to the drama. Someone coughed. A baby cried briefly before being hushed. The PA system crackled with a distant gate change announcement. Camille checked her watch again. 4 minutes until boarding. She could feel her carefully maintained composure beginning to fray at the edges. Not because she was afraid or intimidated, but because she was tired. Bone-deep tired of having to prove herself in situations where proof should never have been required. She thought about all the indignities she had endured over the years. The time a security guard at a conference followed her around because he assumed she didn't belong. the venture capitalist who asked if she was the secretary during a pitch meeting for her own company, the academic peers who questioned whether her research was really her own. Each incident had been small, seemingly insignificant in isolation, but they accumulated like sand in a shoe, creating a constant irritation that never quite went away. Linda finished her theatrical typing and looked up with an expression of manufactured concern. "I'm showing some irregularities with this booking," she announced. "We're going to need to sort this out before you can board." It was a lie, and everyone within earshot sensed it. Sophia's head snapped up from her screen, her expression shocked. A businessman in the line behind Camille muttered something under his breath. Michael Thompson adjusted his phone angle to better capture the interaction for his live stream. What kind of irregularities? Camille asked, her voice carrying an edge for the first time. Linda's smile was pure predator. "That's between me and the passenger services team. If you'll just step over to the customer service desk." She gestured toward a desk 30 feet away, effectively removing Camille from the boarding line and making her miss her flight. It was a power play disguised as procedure humiliation, wrapped in the flag of corporate policy. Camille stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere. My ticket is valid. My seat is assigned and boarding begins in 3 minutes. I suggest you contact your supervisor if you have questions about my right to be here." The battle lines were drawn. Linda had committed to her course of action and couldn't back down without losing face in front of a gate full of passengers. Camille had drawn her line in the sand and wouldn't retreat without abandoning her principles. Between them stretched a chasm of misunderstanding, prejudice, and pride that was about to swallow them both. Neither woman knew that in 15 minutes the most powerful person in the company would arrive at this very gate. Neither could predict that this moment of petty cruelty would trigger a chain reaction that would reshape an entire corporation. They only knew that they were locked in a battle of wills that felt much larger than a simple boarding dispute. The clock above the gate clicked to 2:51 p.m. Boarding was supposed to begin in 1 minute. Around them, passengers began gathering their belongings, anticipating the call for Group 1 boarding. The normal rhythms of air travel pressed forward, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the gate counter. Linda reached for her radio, her finger hovering over the call button. She was about to escalate this situation beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. She was about to call security on one of the most accomplished aerospace scientists in the world. She was about to make the worst mistake of her career. But she didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she had the power to make this woman's day difficult, and she was angry enough to use it. Security to Gate B14. "We have a disruptive passenger situation." Linda's voice crackled through her radio, cutting through the gate area like a verbal slap. The words hung in the air with the weight of accusation and threat. Around the boarding area, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison toward the gate counter where Dr. Camille Brooks stood, her boarding pass still clutched in her hand, her expression shifting from frustration to disbelief. Disruptive. Camille's voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet space. "I'm standing here with a valid ticket waiting to board my flight. How exactly is that disruptive?" But Linda was already drunk on the power of her position, emboldened by the radio call that had officially escalated the situation. She stepped closer to Camille, her voice rising to ensure every passenger in the area could hear her. "Ma'am, you need to calm down and cooperate with our verification process. Your aggressive behavior is making other passengers uncomfortable." It was a masterclass in gaslighting, turning Camille's calm professionalism into aggressive behavior and her reasonable questions into evidence of disruption. Several passengers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Michael Thompson continued live streaming his phone, now capturing an audience that was growing by the minute. "This is unbelievable," he narrated quietly into his phone. "This woman is literally just standing there with her boarding pass and they're calling security on her. I've been watching this whole thing unfold and she hasn't raised her voice once." Sofia Delgado could no longer remain silent. She stepped forward slightly, her voice hesitant but clear. Linda. I processed her ticket earlier. It's completely valid. The booking is legitimate. Linda whirled on her subordinate with a fury that made Sophia step back. Did I ask for your opinion? Get back to your station and stay out of this. The rebuke was harsh enough to make several passengers wince. A woman with a toddler pulled her child closer as if Linda's anger might be contagious. The elderly couple in matching Hawaiian shirts looked at each other with the kind of knowing glance that spoke of decades of shared experiences with unreasonable authority figures. Camille watched the interaction with growing clarity about what she was facing. This wasn't about her ticket or any supposed irregularities. This was about a person drunk on a small amount of power determined to use it against someone she perceived as vulnerable. It was a dynamic Camille had seen countless times in various forms. The department head who questioned her research methods, the conference organizer who suggested she might be more comfortable presenting in a smaller session, the venture capitalist who asked if she was sure she understood the technical aspects of her own innovation. I need to see some additional identification. Linda continued, turning back to Camille. A credit card proof of employment, something that verifies you're who you claim to be. The request was absurd and potentially illegal. Airlines didn't require proof of employment to board flights. Credit cards weren't verification documents for third-party bookings. Linda was making up requirements on the spot, confident that her uniform and authority would allow her to get away with it. You've seen my driver's license, which matches my boarding pass, Camille replied. Her voice still controlled but with steel underneath. That's all the identification I'm required to provide. And for the record, demanding additional documentation based on someone's appearance is discrimination. The word discrimination landed in the gate area like a hand grenade. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch suddenly focused entirely on the interaction. Michael Thompson's live stream comments section exploded with viewers expressing outrage and disbelief. The businessman behind Camille pulled out his own phone and began recording. Linda's face flushed red. Being called out for discrimination in front of dozens of passengers was exactly the kind of public humiliation she had been trying to inflict on Camille, but now the tables had turned. Her response was to double down rather than de-escalate. Don't you dare accuse me of discrimination, she snapped. I treat every passenger exactly the same. You're the one causing problems here, not me. A voice from the crowd spoke up. She's not causing any problems. She's just standing there. It was an older black man in a business suit, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I've been watching this whole thing, and that lady hasn't done anything wrong. More voices began to murmur agreement. The crowd was starting to turn against Linda, and she could feel her control of the situation slipping away. In her mind, she was the victim here, just trying to do her job while being attacked by an unreasonable passenger and unsupportive bystanders. The possibility that she might be wrong, that her actions might be unjustified, never seriously crossed her mind. Everyone needs to mind their own business, Linda announced loudly. This is airline business, not a public forum. But it was too late for that. Michael Thompson's live stream had grown to over 2,000 viewers, and the numbers were climbing rapidly. Comments were flooding in. This is absolutely disgusting. Call corporate. Right now, I'm never flying Skybridge again. Where is her supervisor? Someone needs to report this. The businessman who had spoken up approached the gate counter. I'd like to speak to a supervisor, he said calmly. This situation is completely inappropriate. Sir, please return to your seat, Linda replied, but her voice was shaking now. The confrontation was spiraling far beyond her ability to control it. There are no seats, the man replied reasonably. We're all standing in line waiting to board, and we're all witnessing what appears to be harassment of a legitimate passenger. More passengers began voicing their support. A young woman in scrubs, clearly a medical professional, stepped forward. I'm a nurse and I fly this route regularly for work. I've never seen a gate agent demand proof of employment before boarding. This is not normal. A middle-aged white woman with obvious expensive accessories joined in. I fly first class frequently, and nobody ever questions my right to be here. This is clearly discriminatory." The crowd was becoming a chorus of disapproval, and Linda found herself facing not just one difficult passenger, but an entire gate full of witnesses who were documenting her every word and action. In the age of social media, there was nowhere to hide from public accountability. Sophia made another attempt to defuse the situation. "Linda, maybe we should just board her. The ticket really is valid and we're running late." But Linda was past the point of rational decision-making. She had committed to this course of action, and admitting she was wrong would feel like admitting defeat. Pride, anger, and prejudice had combined into a toxic mixture that clouded her judgment completely. "I'm calling my supervisor," she announced, reaching for her radio again. "And security needs to hurry up and get here." The security call crackled over the airport's communication system, reaching the desk of Frank Williams, airport security supervisor. Frank was a 20-year veteran of airport security, a man who had worked his way up from baggage screening to supervisory positions through a combination of competence and an unquestioning faith in authority structures. When he received the call about a disruptive passenger at gate B14, he assumed it was routine. Someone drunk, someone who had missed their flight and was causing a scene, someone who didn't understand that airline rules were non-negotiable. Frank grabbed his radio and headed toward Terminal B, his mind already categorizing this as a simple matter of removing someone who didn't belong. He had done it hundreds of times before. What he didn't expect was to arrive at gate B14 and find a well-dressed professional woman standing calmly in a boarding line while dozens of passengers recorded her with their phones. "What's the situation here?" Frank asked Linda as he approached, his hand resting instinctively on his radio. Linda's relief at seeing backup was visible. "We have a passenger with a questionable ticket trying to board first class. She's being confrontational and refusing to cooperate with verification procedures." Frank looked at Camille, taking in her professional attire, her calm demeanor, and her obvious composure under pressure. Nothing about her appearance or behavior suggested someone who was disruptive in any conventional sense, but he had been called here by airline personnel, and in his experience, airline personnel knew their business. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Camille in the tone he might use with a small child, "I need you to step away from the boarding line while we sort this out." "There's nothing to sort out," Camille replied, her voice still steady despite the mounting pressure. "I have a valid boarding pass issued by the airline for a seat I legitimately purchased, or rather, that was purchased on my behalf by the conference I'm attending." Frank had heard every excuse, every story, every attempt at justification that frustrated passengers could devise. In his mind, people who were innocent didn't end up requiring security intervention. The fact that he had been called meant there was a problem, and problems required solutions. "The gate agent says there are irregularities with your booking," Frank said, his voice taking on the officious tone of someone who wasn't interested in debate. "Until that's resolved, you can't board this aircraft." Michael Thompson's live stream had now reached 5,000 viewers, and the comments section was moving too fast to read. Screenshots were being posted to Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. The incident was reaching far beyond Gate B14, beyond DFW Airport, beyond Texas. In the interconnected world of social media, injustice could become a national conversation in a matter of minutes. "This is insane," Michael narrated quietly into his phone. "They're treating this professional woman like she's some kind of criminal, and she hasn't done anything except exist while black in a first-class line." The elderly couple in Hawaiian shirts approached Frank with the confidence of people who had lived long enough to recognize injustice when they saw it. "Officer," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience, "we've been watching this entire interaction. This lady has done absolutely nothing wrong." His wife nodded vigorously. "We fly all the time, and we've never seen anything like this. This is just wrong." Frank was beginning to feel the weight of public attention in a way that made him uncomfortable. He was accustomed to dealing with individual troublemakers, not crowds of supportive witnesses with cameras. But Linda was still insisting that there were problems with the ticket, and Frank's training told him to support airline personnel in disputes with passengers. "I appreciate your concern," he told the couple, "but this is between the airline and their passenger. I need everyone to step back and let us handle this professionally." Professionally. The businessman who had been recording spoke up again. "There's nothing professional about what's happening here. This is harassment, pure and simple." The nurse in scrubs stepped forward again. "I work in emergency medicine, and I know what conflict de-escalation looks like. This is the opposite of that. You're making this situation worse, not better." But Frank's worldview didn't allow for the possibility that he might be on the wrong side of a situation. In his mind, if people were upset with his actions, it was because they didn't understand the complexities of airport security. If passengers were recording him, it was because they were looking for trouble, rather than because they were witnessing injustice. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to Camille with growing impatience, "I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from the boarding line. If you don't comply voluntarily, I'll have to escort you myself." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was rapidly growing out of control. Around the gate area, passengers exchanged looks of disbelief and outrage. Sophia covered her face with her hands, recognizing that this situation had moved far beyond any reasonable response to a simple boarding issue. Camille felt the eyes of dozens of strangers on her, their phones capturing her face, her reactions, her responses to this escalating humiliation. She thought about her keynote speech tomorrow morning about the prestigious conference that was expecting her about the professional reputation she had spent decades building. She thought about giving in, stepping aside, avoiding the confrontation that seemed to be rushing toward her like a freight train. But then she thought about every other woman who might face this same treatment, every other professional who might be judged by their appearance rather than their credentials, every other person who might be humiliated and intimidated into compliance. Sometimes dignity required taking a stand, even when standing was uncomfortable. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gate area. "I am Dr. Camille Brooks. I am an aerospace materials scientist and the keynote speaker at tomorrow's International Aviation Innovation Summit in Seattle. I have a legitimate first-class ticket for this flight. I have provided all required identification. I have done nothing disruptive, aggressive, or inappropriate. And I am not moving from this line." Frank Williams had reached the limit of his patience. In his 20 years of airport security work, passengers who refused direct orders from authority figures were problems that required immediate and decisive action. The fact that this woman was articulate, professional, and calm didn't register as evidence that she might be right. It registered as evidence that she was dangerously confident in her defiance. "Ma'am, you're now interfering with airport security operations," he announced loudly enough for the entire gate area to hear. "I'm going to need you to come with me to the security office where we can sort this out properly." "I'm not going anywhere," Camille replied, her voice steady but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "I have a flight to catch, and nothing you've said gives you legal authority to detain me." Frank's face reddened. Challenging his authority was something he couldn't tolerate, especially in front of witnesses. In his mind, respect for authority was the foundation of civil society, and people who questioned that authority were threats to order itself. "Ma'am, you can walk to the security office or I can escort you. Your choice." The ultimatum was delivered with the confidence of someone who had never seriously considered that he might be wrong. Frank stepped closer to Camille, close enough that she could smell his coffee breath, close enough that his physical presence became intimidating rather than merely official. Camille didn't step back. She had faced down hostile academic committees, aggressive venture capitalists, and skeptical military officers. A security guard with an inflated sense of his own importance wasn't going to make her retreat from her principles. "You have no legal basis for detaining me," she said clearly. "I have not committed any crime, violated any regulation, or behaved in any way that justifies your intervention. This is harassment, and everyone here knows it." Michael Thompson's live stream had exploded to over 10,000 viewers. Comments were pouring in faster than anyone could read them. "Call the police. This is a civil rights violation. I'm a lawyer, and this is completely illegal. Where is airport management? This woman is about to be assaulted for flying while black." The businessman who had been recording approached Frank directly. "Sir, I'm an attorney, and I'm telling you right now that you have no legal authority to detain this woman. She has committed no crime and violated no regulations. If you lay hands on her, you'll be facing assault charges." Frank turned on the attorney with the same aggressive energy he had been directing at Camille. "Sir, I need you to step back and mind your own business. This is official security business. This became everyone's business the moment you started harassing an innocent passenger in public," the attorney replied. "And I'm not stepping back from witnessing what appears to be a civil rights violation in progress." More passengers were joining the conversation. The nurse in scrubs was now standing beside Camille in a gesture of solidarity. The elderly couple had moved closer, their faces showing the kind of moral outrage that comes from witnessing clear injustice. Even passengers who had initially minded their own business were being drawn into the confrontation by its obvious wrongness. Sophia made one last desperate attempt to prevent disaster. "Frank, Linda, please. Can we just board her?" "The ticket is valid. This is getting completely out of hand." Linda whirled on Sophia with a viciousness that shocked everyone watching. "I told you to stay out of this. One more word from you and you'll be written up for insubordination." The threat against Sophia for trying to do the right thing was the final straw for many passengers. A chorus of voices erupted. "This is completely insane. You're threatening an employee for being reasonable. Where is your supervisor? This is the worst customer service I've ever seen." Frank felt the situation spiraling completely beyond his control, but his training and instincts told him to regain authority through force if necessary. He reached for his radio to call for backup, then made the decision that would end his career. He grabbed Camille's arm. The physical contact was like lightning striking the gate area. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Michael Thompson zoomed in on his phone camera. The businessman attorney immediately began shouting, "Assault! He just committed assault. Everyone record this." Camille felt Frank's fingers digging into her upper arm, felt herself being pulled away from the boarding line against her will. The humiliation was complete now. She was being physically manhandled in front of dozens of strangers, treated like a criminal for the crime of existing in a space where someone had decided she didn't belong. But she didn't resist physically. She didn't shout or struggle or give anyone an excuse to escalate further. Instead, she spoke clearly and calmly, her voice carrying across the gate area, with the authority of someone who refused to be silenced. "I am being physically assaulted for trying to board a flight with a valid ticket. Everyone here is witnessing this. This man has no legal authority to detain me, and he is violating my civil rights." Frank began pulling her toward the corridor that led to the security offices, his grip tight enough to bruise. With each step, the crowd of passengers grew more agitated. Phones were recording from every angle. The businessman attorney was speaking rapidly into his phone, calling what sounded like colleagues or authorities. "This is unbelievable," Michael Thompson continued narrating to his now 15,000 viewers. "They are literally dragging this professional woman away from her flight for absolutely no reason. This is 2024, and we're watching someone being assaulted for flying while black." Sophia was openly crying now, helpless to stop what she knew was a terrible injustice. Other Skybridge employees had gathered at the edge of the scene, their faces showing shock and dismay at what was unfolding in their airline's name. As Frank dragged Camille away from the gate, the scene transformed from a local incident to a viral moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms. The image of a well-dressed black woman being physically removed from an airport gate for no apparent reason struck at the heart of every conversation about justice, dignity, and equality in modern America. Michael Thompson's live stream was being shared across platforms in real time. Screenshots were already appearing on Twitter with hashtags like "Flying While Black" and "Skybridge Shame." TikTok users were creating response videos expressing outrage and disbelief. Facebook posts were spreading through networks of friends and family members who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The businessman attorney, whose name was Robert Chen, was now live tweeting the incident with the kind of legal analysis that made the situation impossible to ignore live thread. Watching airport security assault professional woman for attempting to board with valid ticket. This is textbook civil rights violation. We'll be filing complaints with TSA FAA and DFW Airport Justice for Dr. Brooks. Within minutes, his thread had thousands of retweets and was being picked up by larger accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers. The story was spreading beyond just the people who had witnessed it firsthand. Dr. Brooks maintained her dignity even as she was being physically removed from the gate area. She didn't struggle or fight back, but she continued to speak clearly for the benefit of all the cameras recording her. My name is Dr. Camille Brooks. I am a scientist. I have a valid ticket. I have done nothing wrong. This is happening because of how I look, not because of anything I've done. Her words were being captured by dozens of phones, each one streaming or recording for later posting. The message was clear, powerful, and impossible to deny. This wasn't a complex situation requiring investigation or analysis. This was obviously wrong, and everyone could see it. Linda Rodriguez was beginning to realize that this situation had moved far beyond anything she had intended. What had started as a simple power play to put someone in their place had become a public relations nightmare that was being broadcast live to thousands of people. But she was too committed to her course of action to back down now. Everyone needs to disperse and mind their own business, she announced, but her voice was shaking. This is airline security business. This is everyone's business now, shouted the nurse in scrubs. You've made it everyone's business by assaulting an innocent passenger in public. Other passengers were now openly confronting Linda and demanding answers. The elderly man in the Hawaiian shirt approached the gate counter with the kind of righteous anger that comes from witnessing clear injustice. Young lady, you should be ashamed of yourself. In 60 years of flying, I have never seen anything as disgraceful as what you've done here today. His wife nodded vigorously. We're going to make sure everyone knows how Skybridge treats their passengers. This is absolutely unacceptable. More passengers were pulling out phones to record their own testimony about what they had witnessed. The gate area had become an impromptu courtroom where dozens of witnesses were providing evidence of discrimination and assault. A young black woman who had been quietly watching the entire incident finally spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. I fly every week for work, and I always wonder if this is going to happen to me. Watching this makes me sick to my stomach. Her words resonated with other minority passengers who had been silent, and suddenly more voices joined the chorus of outrage. This could have been me. This could have been my daughter. This is exactly why people are afraid to travel. How many times has this happened when nobody was recording? The conversation was expanding beyond just this incident to larger questions about treatment of minority passengers throughout the airline industry. Social media posts were already comparing this incident to other viral videos of airline discrimination, creating a narrative about problems throughout the industry. Frank had successfully removed Camille from the immediate gate area, but he hadn't stopped the crowd reaction or the social media explosion. If anything, dragging her away had made the situation worse by providing even more dramatic footage for the phones that were still recording. Sophia finally reached her breaking point. Despite Linda's threats, she couldn't stand by and watch this injustice continue without speaking up. Stop! She shouted, her voice carrying across the gate area. Everyone just stop! I processed her ticket myself. It's completely legitimate. There are no irregularities. She hasn't done anything wrong. Her confession landed like a bomb in the middle of the crisis. If there really were no irregularities with the ticket, then everything that had happened was purely based on discrimination. Linda's face went white, as she realized that her own employee had just undermined her entire justification for this confrontation. The crowd's anger reached a new level. Passengers who had been giving Linda the benefit of the doubt now realized that she had been lying from the beginning. The situation had moved from merely inappropriate to actively malicious. Michael Thompson captured Sophia's admission on his live stream, where it would be replayed thousands of times in the coming hours. The comments section exploded with new outrage. She admitted there was no problem with the ticket. This was purely racial profiling. They need to be arrested. This is criminal. James Foster, the airport operations manager, finally arrived at the scene after being alerted by multiple passenger complaints. He took one look at the chaos, the phones recording everything, the obvious distress of the passengers, and the complete breakdown of normal operations, and realized he was looking at a disaster that would likely cost people their jobs. But even he didn't realize that in just a few minutes the most powerful person in Skybridge Airlines would arrive at this very gate and witness the aftermath of what his employees had done to one of the most important people in his professional life. The viral moment was complete. Dr. Camille Brooks had been transformed from an anonymous passenger into a symbol of dignity under pressure, and the video evidence of her treatment would soon be seen by millions of people around the world. The question now was, what would happen when the people with real power learned about what had been done in their name? Jonathan Mitchell was supposed to be in a boardroom in downtown Dallas reviewing quarterly performance metrics with his executive team. As CEO of Skybridge Airlines, his days were typically scheduled in 15-minute increments, every moment accounted for by meetings, calls, and strategic decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of passengers. But sometimes, leadership required departing from the schedule. He had been driving to the corporate headquarters when his chief operating officer, Rachel Kim, called with concerning reports from their DFW hub. Customer service complaints were spiking and real-time social media mentions were climbing rapidly, and their corporate communications team was fielding calls from journalists about an incident at Gate B14. What kind of incident, Jonathan had asked, changing course toward the airport instead of the office? We're still gathering details, but it involves a passenger complaint about discriminatory treatment. It's going viral on social media. We need damage control immediately. Jonathan Mitchell had built Skybridge Airlines from a regional carrier into a national powerhouse by obsessing over customer experience and operational excellence. He had zero tolerance for the kind of customer service failures that destroyed airline reputations overnight. If there was a problem at DFW, he would address it personally and immediately. He arrived at Terminal B with Rachel and 2 corporate security officers, expecting to find a routine customer service dispute that could be resolved with apologies and appropriate compensation. What he found instead was Gate B14 in complete chaos, with dozens of agitated passengers, security personnel, and airport operations staff trying to manage what looked like the aftermath of a riot. As he approached the gate area, he could hear raised voices, see phones recording everything, and feel the electric tension that comes when a situation has spiraled completely out of control. But it wasn't until he got close enough to hear the specific words being shouted that his blood ran cold. Where did they take Dr. Brooks? This is completely outrageous. I got the whole thing on video. Someone needs to call the police. Dr. Brooks. The name hit him like a physical blow. There was only one Dr. Brooks who would be flying first class from DFW to Seattle. Only one person with that name who would be traveling to the kind of conference that justified premium airline tickets. Dr. Camille Brooks, his professor, his mentor, the woman who had shaped his understanding of engineering leadership and integrity. The brilliant mind who had pushed him to excel beyond what he thought possible, who had seen potential in him when he couldn't see it himself. Jonathan's pace quickened as he moved through the crowd of passengers, his executive team struggling to keep up. He was looking for a specific face, hoping desperately that he was wrong, that this couldn't possibly be about the woman who had changed his life 15 years ago. But then he saw her. Dr. Camille Brooks was sitting in a plastic chair in the corridor leading to the airport security offices, flanked by two security guards who looked deeply uncomfortable with their assignment. Her clothes were slightly rumpled from being physically handled. Her expression was composed but weary, like someone who had been fighting a battle she shouldn't have had to fight. She was exactly as he remembered her, brilliant, dignified, uncompromising in her principles. Seeing her in this position, treated like a criminal instead of the respected scientist, she was filled Jonathan with a rage so pure and hot that it took all his self-control not to explode immediately. Rachel Kim noticed his reaction and realized that this was personal for him in a way she hadn't expected. "Jonathan, do you know her?" He couldn't speak for a moment. The words were trapped behind a combination of fury and heartbreak that made coherent thought difficult. When he finally found his voice, it was barely controlled. "She was my professor at MIT. She's one of the most brilliant minds in aerospace engineering, and apparently my employees just assaulted her for trying to board our aircraft." Rachel's face went pale. A customer service failure was manageable. Assaulting a prominent scientist and former MIT professor was a corporate catastrophe. Jonathan began walking toward the security corridor with the kind of purposeful stride that made people move out of his way. Airport personnel who recognized him tried to approach with explanations and justifications, but he brushed past them without acknowledgement. He had eyes for only one person. Dr. Brooks looked up as he approached, and for a moment neither of them spoke. 15 years collapsed in an instant. She was seeing the eager young student who had hung on her every word in Materials Science 402, who had stayed after class to ask challenging questions, who had written a thesis that still influenced aircraft design today. He was seeing the professor who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, who had pushed him to standards he didn't know he could achieve, who had shaped not just his technical knowledge, but his understanding of what it meant to be a leader. "Professor Brooks," he said quietly, the formal title coming automatically despite the years that had passed. She studied his face for a moment, recognition dawning slowly. Jonathan Mitchell." "Yes, ma'am. And I am so incredibly sorry for what's been done to you." The corridor that had been buzzing with official activity fell silent as airport personnel recognized the CEO of Skybridge Airlines approaching their detained passenger. Frank Williams, who had been standing guard over Dr. Brooks with the self-importance of someone doing crucial work, suddenly realized that his world was about to collapse. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, but Jonathan held up a hand that cut him off like a blade. "Not one word from you," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Not one single word." He knelt beside Dr. Brooks's chair, lowering himself to her eye level in a gesture of respect and apology. Around them, airport employees began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a CEO personally apologizing to someone who had been mistreated by his company. "Professor Brooks, I cannot begin to express how ashamed I am of what you've experienced today. The way you've been treated is antithetical to everything this company claims to stand for, and it's a personal betrayal of everything you taught me about dignity and respect." Camille looked at the young man who had become a powerful executive, seeing in his face the same earnestness and integrity that had made him special as a student. She also saw genuine anguish over what had happened to her, and that recognition began to soften the hard edges of her anger. "Your employees assaulted me, Jonathan," she said quietly. "They physically dragged me from a boarding line because they decided I didn't belong in first class. In 2024, in America." Each word landed like a hammer blow on Jonathan's conscience. He had spent his entire career building a company culture based on excellence and respect, and in one afternoon his employees had destroyed everything he thought he had accomplished. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And there will be consequences, immediate consequences, Frank Williams realized he was about to lose his job, and desperation made him speak, despite Jonathan's warning. "Sir, we were just following protocol. The gate agent reported irregularities with her ticket, and we—" Jonathan's head turned toward Frank with the kind of deadly focus that made everyone in the corridor take a step back. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with the promise of destruction. The gate agent lied. There were no irregularities. This woman is Dr. Camille Brooks, one of the most respected aerospace scientists in the world. She was flying to Seattle to deliver the keynote address at the International Aviation Innovation Summit. She has every right to be in first class, and more importantly, she has the right to be treated with basic human dignity by employees of my airline. Frank's face went ashen as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. Assaulting a random passenger was bad enough to end his career. Assaulting a prominent scientist on her way to a major conference was the kind of mistake that would destroy any chance he had of working in aviation again. "Sir, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care to know." Jonathan cut him off. "You saw a black woman in first class and assumed she didn't belong there. That assumption led you to commit assault in front of dozens of witnesses." Rachel Kim, who had been documenting the situation for legal purposes, approached carefully. She could see that Jonathan was operating on pure emotion, and while his instincts were right, he needed to be strategic about how he handled the aftermath. "Jonathan," she said softly, "we need to address the immediate situation first, then handle the broader implications." He nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her approach. But first he needed to make something absolutely clear to everyone present. "Dr. Brooks," he said, turning back to his former professor, "you have my personal guarantee that the people responsible for this will be held accountable, immediately, and you have my commitment that this company will do everything in its power to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." Camille studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his expression, but also recognizing the complexity of the situation they were both in. "Jonathan, I appreciate your apology. But this isn't just about me. This is about every person who gets treated like they don't belong because of how they look. This is about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place." Her words carried the same teaching authority he remembered from her classroom, the same ability to frame individual incidents as part of larger problems that needed solving. She was turning this personal confrontation into a teachable moment about leadership and organizational culture. "You're absolutely right," he said. "And that's exactly why I need your help to fix it." Word was spreading through the airport that something extraordinary was happening at Gate B14. Passengers were sharing videos and social media posts that had captured the CEO of an airline personally apologizing to a passenger who had been mistreated. Airport employees were gathering at a respectful distance, witnessing the kind of leadership moment that would be discussed for years. Jonathan stood and addressed the crowd that had gathered in the corridor. His voice carried clearly to everyone present, ensuring that his words would be captured by the dozens of phones still recording. "My name is Jonathan Mitchell. I am the CEO of Skybridge Airlines. The woman who was assaulted by my employees is Dr. Camille Brooks, one of the most brilliant minds in aerospace engineering, and my former professor at MIT. She was traveling to Seattle to deliver the keynote address at the International Aviation Innovation Summit. She had every right to be in first class, and more importantly, she had the right to be treated with dignity and respect." The crowd that had been agitated and angry began to settle into focused attention. This was unprecedented, a CEO taking personal responsibility for his employees' actions and doing it publicly. What happened to Dr. Brooks today is unacceptable, inexcusable, and directly contrary to the values this company claims to uphold. It will not stand, and there will be immediate consequences for everyone involved. Michael Thompson, who had been live streaming the entire incident, was now broadcasting to over 20,000 viewers as the story took this unexpected turn. The comments section was exploding with reactions. The CEO is apologizing personally. This is how you handle a crisis. Fire everyone involved. This is what accountability looks like. Jonathan turned back to address Frank Williams and the other security personnel who had been involved in detaining Dr. Brooks. His voice remained controlled, but there was no mistaking the finality in his tone. Frank Williams, you are terminated effective immediately for assault of a passenger, abuse of authority, and violating the civil rights of a customer. Security will escort you from the premises, and you will never work for this company again. Frank opened his mouth to protest, but Jonathan's expression made it clear that any argument would only make things worse. Corporate security officers who had arrived with Jonathan stepped forward to enforce the termination. Officer Martinez. Jonathan addressed Frank's subordinate. You will be suspended pending a full investigation of your role in this incident. If our investigation confirms that you participated in assaulting Dr. Brooks, you will be terminated as well. The swift action sent a message to everyone present that this wasn't going to be handled quietly through internal processes. Accountability was immediate and public. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and made a call that everyone in the corridor could hear. Linda, this is Jonathan Mitchell. I'm at Gate B14 and I need you here immediately. A pause while he listened to the response. I don't care what meeting you're in. Get here now. He was calling Linda Rodriguez, the gate agent who had started this entire incident. She was about to face the most powerful person in the company and account for her actions in front of the same crowd she had humiliated Dr. Brooks in front of. While they waited for Linda to arrive, Jonathan continued addressing the passengers and airport personnel who had witnessed the incident. I want everyone here to understand something. Dr. Brooks didn't just teach me material science at MIT. She taught me about integrity, about standing up for what's right, and about treating every person with the dignity they deserve. The fact that employees of my company treated her this way is not just a failure of customer service. It's a betrayal of everything she taught me about leadership. His words were being captured by multiple cameras and would soon be viewed millions of times across social media platforms. But more importantly, they were being heard by Dr. Brooks herself, who was seeing a reflection of the values she had tried to instill in her students. Jonathan, she said quietly, you don't need to make this about me personally. This needs to be about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about both, he replied. Because fixing this properly means understanding that every passenger deserves to be treated the way I would want you to be treated. With respect, dignity, and the assumption that they belong exactly where they are. Linda Rodriguez appeared at the end of the corridor, walking reluctantly toward a conversation she knew would end her career. She had heard through the airport communication system that the CEO was personally involved, but she was still hoping she could explain her way out of trouble. She was wrong. Linda Rodriguez approached the group in the security corridor with the false confidence of someone who still believed she could control the narrative. She had spent the 20 minutes since Jonathan's call preparing her explanation. Dr. Brooks had been hostile, uncooperative, possibly fraudulent. In Linda's mind, she had been protecting the airline from a potential security threat and deserved commendation, not criticism. That delusion lasted exactly as long as it took for her to see Dr. Brooks sitting in the chair where she had been detained, flanked by security guards with the CEO of the airline kneeling beside her in obvious deference and respect. Linda Rodriguez, Jonathan said as she approached his voice carrying across the corridor so that every passenger and employee could hear. You are the gate agent responsible for this incident. It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Mr. Mitchell Linda began, but Jonathan cut her off with a gesture that brooked no argument. You initiated a confrontation with Dr. Brooks based purely on your assumptions about who belongs in first class. You lied about irregularities with her ticket. You called security on a legitimate passenger who had done nothing wrong. You escalated a situation that never needed to happen in the first place. Each accusation landed like a physical blow, and Linda could see her career disintegrating in real time. Around her, passengers were recording everything, ensuring that her actions and their consequences would be preserved forever. "Sir, I was just following protocol." "You were following your prejudices," Jonathan interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "There is no protocol that requires harassing passengers based on their appearance. There is no procedure that justifies lying about ticket irregularities. And there is absolutely no excuse for what you put Dr. Brooks through today." Dr. Brooks herself spoke from her chair, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone Jonathan remembered from her lectures. "Linda, did you or did you not verify with your computer system that my ticket was legitimate before you called security?" Linda's mouth opened and closed without sound. She couldn't admit that the ticket had been valid from the beginning without acknowledging that everything she had done was motivated by bias rather than legitimate security concerns. But she also couldn't lie in front of dozens of witnesses who had heard Sophia confirm the ticket's validity. Sophia Delgado, who had been hovering at the edge of the group, stepped forward with the courage of someone who had finally found her voice. "Mr. Mitchell," she said clearly, "I processed Dr. Brooks's ticket earlier today during pre-boarding. It was completely valid. There were never any irregularities." Linda knew that, but she harassed Dr. Brooks anyway. The confirmation from Linda's own subordinate was devastating. It removed any possibility that this had been a well-intentioned mistake or an overabundance of caution. This had been deliberate harassment based on racial profiling, pure and simple. Jonathan's voice, when he spoke again, was quiet, but filled with absolute finality. "Linda Rodriguez, you are terminated effective immediately for discrimination against a passenger lying to security personnel, abuse of your authority, and bringing shame on this company and everyone who works for it. You will be escorted from the premises immediately, and you will never work for Skybridge Airlines again." Linda finally found her voice, but only to make everything worse. "This is unfair. I was just doing my job. How was I supposed to know she was important?" The question revealed everything that was wrong with her thinking. In Linda's mind, the problem wasn't that she had discriminated against someone. The problem was that she had discriminated against the wrong someone. She still didn't understand that every passenger deserved the respect she had failed to provide. "She shouldn't have to be important," Dr. Brooks said, rising from her chair for the first time since being detained. "Every passenger who boards your aircraft with a legitimate ticket deserves basic human dignity. The fact that you think my professional status makes a difference proves exactly why you shouldn't be working in customer service." Jonathan nodded at his corporate security team, who stepped forward to escort Linda away. But before she left, he wanted to make sure his message was absolutely clear to everyone present. "Let me be very clear about something," he announced to the crowd, "Dr. Brooks was not mistreated because she's a prominent scientist or my former professor. She was mistreated because an employee of this company saw a black woman in first class and assumed she didn't belong there. That assumption led to harassment, escalation, and ultimately assault. This is exactly the kind of thinking that has no place at Skybridge Airlines or anywhere else." As Linda was escorted away, her career in aviation effectively over Jonathan turned his attention to the broader implications of what had happened. The immediate justice was important, but the real work would be ensuring this never happened again. Rachel Kim had been working her phone constantly since arriving at the gate, coordinating with the corporate communications team, legal department, and executive leadership. The incident was already national news, with major outlets picking up the social media videos and demanding statements from the airline. "Jonathan," she said quietly, approaching with a tablet showing the viral spread of the incident across social platforms, "we need to get ahead of this story immediately. The videos have been viewed over 2 million times in the last hour." Jonathan looked at the metrics, shares, comments, news coverage that quantified his company's reputational crisis. But more importantly, he looked at Dr. Brooks, who was watching him carefully to see how he would handle the pressure of public scrutiny. "What do you recommend?" he asked Rachel. but he was looking at Dr. Brooks as he said it, making it clear that her opinion mattered more than any corporate communication strategy. Standard crisis management would be a written statement expressing regret and promising investigation, Rachel replied. But given the public nature of this and your personal connection to Dr. Brooks, I think we need something more direct. Jonathan nodded, then addressed the crowd of passengers who were still gathered in the corridor, many of them continuing to record. I'm going to make a public statement about what happened here today, and I want everyone to hear it. Not a corporate press release, but a personal acknowledgement of failure and a commitment to change. He moved to a position where the maximum number of phones could capture his words. Understanding that in the age of social media, authentic communication required meeting people where they were, rather than expecting them to come to corporate channels. My name is Jonathan Mitchell, and I'm the CEO of Skybridge Airlines. Today, employees of my company discriminated against, harassed, and physically assaulted Dr. Camille Brooks, a prominent scientist and my former professor, simply because they decided she didn't belong in first class. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. Around him, passengers nodded in approval at his direct acknowledgement of what had happened. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an overabundance of caution. This was racial profiling that escalated to assault, and it happened because we failed to create a culture where such behavior is immediately recognized as unacceptable. Michael Thompson's live stream, which had been broadcasting the entire incident, now had over 30,000 viewers as word spread that the CEO was making an unprecedented public statement. The comments section was moving too fast to read, but the overall sentiment was clear. People were shocked by the direct accountability Jonathan was demonstrating. The employees responsible have been terminated immediately, but firing individuals isn't enough. We need to examine how our hiring training and management practices allowed people with these attitudes to represent our company in the first place. Dr. Brooks stepped forward, and Jonathan turned to include her in the statement. Dr. Brooks, you have every right to pursue legal action against this company. But if you're willing, I'd like to ask for your help in making sure this never happens again. The request was personal and public, creating accountability that went far beyond normal corporate crisis management. He was asking his former professor to help him solve a problem that had revealed fundamental flaws in his organization. Jonathan, she replied, her voice carrying to the cameras. And the crowd accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about prevention. If you're serious about change, then yes, I'll help you. But it has to be real change, not just better training videos. The exchange was being captured by dozens of cameras and would be replayed millions of times in the coming days. But more importantly, it established a framework for addressing workplace discrimination that other companies would study and attempt to replicate. An hour later, Jonathan and Dr. Brooks sat in the Skybridge Airlines executive lounge at DFW, away from the cameras and crowds, but still very much in the public eye through the glass walls that separated the lounge from the main terminal. Rachel, Kim, and other members of the executive team maintained a respectful distance while the two of them talked. I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened today, Jonathan said, his voice heavy with emotion. I built a company and somehow failed to prevent the exact kind of thinking you spent years teaching me to reject. Dr. Brooks studied her former student, seeing in his face the same earnestness that had made him special in her classroom 15 years earlier. But she also saw the weight of leadership and the complexity of managing an organization with thousands of employees. Jonathan, you can't control every interaction every employee has with every customer. But you can control the culture that shapes those interactions. And today showed me that your culture has serious problems. The criticism stung because it was accurate, and because it came from someone whose opinion he valued more than almost anyone else's. Dr. Brooks had always been direct in her feedback, never sugarcoating her assessments when she saw potential being wasted or principles being compromised. Tell me how to fix it, he said simply. It starts with admitting that diversity and inclusion training, as you've probably been doing, it doesn't work. People sit through presentations, check boxes, and forget everything they've learned by the time they get back to their jobs. You need to change behavior, not just awareness. She pulled out her tablet and began outlining the same kind of approach she used to solve complex engineering problems, breaking down the issue into component parts, identifying failure points and designing solutions based on measurable outcomes rather than good intentions. Every hiring decision, every promotion review, every performance evaluation needs to include assessment of how people treat others. You can't just measure technical competence and expect character to take care of itself. Jonathan listened with the same focused attention he had brought to her lectures as a student taking notes on his own device and asking clarifying questions about implementation details. You need accountability mechanisms that don't depend on victims reporting discrimination, anonymous feedback systems, regular surveys, mystery shopping programs that specifically test for bias. And consequences have to be real and immediate, not just coaching and additional training. As she talked, Jonathan could see the approach that had made her such an effective teacher and researcher. She wasn't just critiquing what had gone wrong. She was designing solutions based on evidence and best practices from organizational psychology and change management. The hardest part, she continued, is that you have to be willing to lose people who can't or won't adapt to a culture of genuine respect. Some of your employees will resist change, and you'll have to decide whether keeping them is worth the message their presence sends to everyone else. I'd rather rebuild with people who share our values than maintain the status quo with people who don't. Jonathan replied immediately. Dr. Brooks smiled for the first time since the incident began. That's exactly what I hoped you would say, but saying it is the easy part. Following through when it affects people you like, or high performers who bring in revenue, or long-term employees who have institutional knowledge, that's when your real priorities become clear. Their conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from recruitment strategies to performance metrics to customer feedback processes. By the time they finished, they had outlined a comprehensive approach to organizational change that would become a model for other companies facing similar challenges. Jonathan had personally arranged for Dr. Brooks to travel to Seattle on the Skybridge corporate jet, rather than the commercial flight she had originally been booked on. It was partly a gesture of apology and partly a practical decision. Her presence on a commercial flight would have created media attention and passenger disruption that neither of them wanted. As the aircraft lifted off from DFW Dallas, disappearing beneath them in the Texas twilight, they continued their strategic planning conversation. Rachel Kim joined them, contributing the operational perspective needed to turn Dr. Brooks' recommendations into implementable policies. We'll call it the Brooks Initiative, Jonathan said, naming the comprehensive reform program they were designing, a complete overhaul of our approach to diversity, inclusion, and customer service. Dr. Brooks looked at him with the same expression she had worn when reviewing his thesis 15 years earlier, pleased with his thinking but pushing him to go deeper. Don't name it after me, she said firmly. This isn't about what happened to me personally. This is about creating an environment where what happened to me becomes impossible for anyone. Then what do we call it? She thought for a moment, then smiled. Call it the Dignity Initiative, because that's what this is really about. Treating every person who interacts with your company as if they matter. As the corporate jet flew through the night towards Seattle, the three of them worked on laptops and tablets, creating the framework for changes that would reshape Skybridge Airlines, and they hoped influence practices throughout the aviation industry. The immediate crisis was behind them, but the real work was just beginning. Social media was already spreading their story around the world, creating expectations for follow-through that would be impossible to ignore. By morning, they would need to have concrete plans ready for implementation. But sitting in the quiet luxury of the corporate aircraft, working with people he respected and trusted, Jonathan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the excitement of using his position and resources to solve a problem that really mattered. Dr. Brooks had given him more than an education in material science 15 years ago. She had given him a framework for thinking about leadership and responsibility that was now guiding his response to the biggest challenge of his career. The International Aviation Innovation Summit's main auditorium was packed with 1,200 of the most influential minds in aerospace engineering, airline management, and aviation technology. Dr. Camille Brooks walked onto the stage to sustained applause, but the audience was expecting a presentation on ceramic matrix composites and next-generation materials. They had no idea that she was about to deliver one of the most powerful speeches in the conference's 20-year history. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "I was supposed to start my presentation this morning by talking about breakthrough materials that are revolutionizing aircraft design, and I will get to that. But first I want to tell you about something that happened to me yesterday afternoon that illustrates why the most important innovations in our industry aren't always technological." The audience shifted in their seats, sensing that this wasn't going to be a typical keynote presentation. In the front row, Jonathan sat with his executive team, knowing that Dr. Brooks was about to transform a personal trauma into a teaching moment for the entire industry. Yesterday at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, I was physically removed from a boarding gate because an airline employee decided I didn't belong in first class. I was dragged from the boarding line, detained by security, and treated like a criminal for the crime of flying while black. A ripple of shock and murmurs ran through the auditorium. This was the kind of story that industry leaders heard about in news reports, but rarely confronted directly in their professional environments. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not sharing this story to generate sympathy or to shame anyone in this room. I'm sharing it because it illustrates a fundamental principle that applies to every aspect of our work. Assumptions kill innovation. Bias destroys excellence, and prejudice prevents us from recognizing talent and capability wherever it exists. Dr. Brooks moved away from the podium, walking closer to the audience with the confidence of someone who had commanded lecture halls for decades. The slides behind her, prepared for her materials science presentation, remained dark. In the aircraft industry, we've learned that every assumption must be tested, every bias must be challenged, and every component must be evaluated based on its actual performance rather than how we think it should perform. We've learned this because when we don't, planes fall out of the sky. The aviation professionals in the audience nodded in recognition. Safety in their industry depended on rigorous testing and evidence-based decision-making that left no room for assumptions or wishful thinking. But somehow, when it comes to evaluating people rather than materials, we forget these same principles. We make assumptions about capability based on appearance. We let bias influence our assessment of competence. We prejudge performance based on characteristics that have nothing to do with ability. Jonathan watched from the front row as his former professor transformed yesterday's humiliation into a challenge for everyone present. This was the teaching ability that had made her such an influential figure at MIT, the capacity to turn individual incidents into universal principles. The airline employee who harassed me yesterday made the same mistake that engineers used to make when they assumed certain materials couldn't handle stress loads based on how they looked rather than how they tested. The security officer who physically removed me made the same error that designers used to make when they rejected innovative concepts because they didn't match traditional expectations. Dr. Brooks paused, letting the parallel between technical and social prejudice sink in with her audience of engineers and executives. Here's what I want you to remember from this story. The CEO of that airline, Jonathan Mitchell, is sitting in the front row of this auditorium. He was my student at MIT 15 years ago, and he learned in my materials science lab that assumptions can be deadly and that evidence must always triumph over expectations. Jonathan felt every eye in the auditorium turn toward him, but he didn't look away from the stage. This was Dr. Brooks's moment, and he was honored to be part of her teaching. When Jonathan saw what his employees had done to me, he didn't make excuses or promise investigations or offer corporate non-apology apologies. He fired the people responsible immediately. He acknowledged that his company's culture had failed, and he asked for my help in designing solutions based on evidence rather than hope. The audience began to applaud, recognizing the kind of leadership accountability they rarely saw in corporate crisis management. But Dr. Brooks held up a hand for silence. I'm not telling you this to praise Jonathan's response, although it was exemplary. I'm telling you this to illustrate what real accountability looks like in any organization. When your processes fail, you fix the processes. When your culture produces bad outcomes, you change the culture. When your people make decisions based on bias rather than evidence, you either retrain them or replace them. She moved to the center of the stage, addressing the entire auditorium with the authority of someone who had spent decades solving complex technical problems. Every company represented in this room depends on innovation, excellence, and precision. But if your hiring practices, promotion decisions, and workplace culture are contaminated by the same assumptions that led to yesterday's incident, you're not just failing individual employees and customers. You're limiting your own potential for innovation and excellence. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes. But more importantly, Dr. Brooks had succeeded in connecting a personal experience of discrimination to professional principles that every person in the audience could understand and apply. When she finally moved to her prepared presentation on material science, the audience was primed to think about innovation evidence and challenging assumptions in ways that went far beyond technical specifications. She had used her expertise as a teacher to transform a room full of industry leaders into students ready to examine their own practices and assumptions. The Brooks Initiative, renamed the Dignity Initiative at Dr. Brooks' insistence, had become a case study in organizational change that was being studied by business schools and copied by companies across multiple industries. 6 months after the incident at DFW, the results were measurable and dramatic. Skybridge Airlines had implemented the most comprehensive diversity and inclusion program in the aviation industry. Every employee from baggage handlers to executives completed quarterly training that included role-playing exercises, unconscious bias testing, and real-world scenarios designed to surface and address prejudicial thinking. But more importantly, the company had created accountability mechanisms that made discrimination costly in immediate and personal ways. Performance reviews included specific metrics for respectful customer interaction. Promotion decisions required 360-degree feedback that included input from colleagues of different backgrounds. Anonymous reporting processes allowed passengers and employees to flag problematic behavior without fear of retaliation. The results spoke for themselves. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by 40%, with particularly strong improvements among minority passengers who had previously avoided the airline. Employee engagement surveys showed significant improvements in workplace culture and morale. Most importantly, incidents of discriminatory treatment had virtually disappeared. Linda Rodriguez and Frank Williams had become cautionary tales within the industry. Both had been blacklisted from aviation work and struggled to find employment in any customer-facing role. Their LinkedIn profiles had been flooded with negative comments about their treatment of Dr. Brooks. The incident had followed them beyond their professional lives, affecting personal relationships and community standing. But the impact extended far beyond individual consequences. Other airlines facing public pressure to address their own culture problems had implemented similar programs. The Federal Aviation Administration had begun requiring diversity and inclusion training as part of airline certification processes. Airport authorities nationwide had revised their security protocols to prevent racial profiling. Dr. Brooks had accepted a part-time consulting role with Skybridge, working directly with Jonathan and his executive team to refine and expand the Dignity Initiative. Her academic schedule allowed her to spend 1 week per month with the airline, and her influence on corporate culture was evident in everything from hiring practices to customer service protocols. The broader aerospace industry had taken notice as well. Dr. Brooks found herself in demand as a speaker and consultant, not just for her technical expertise, but for her insights on organizational culture and leadership accountability. The incident that had humiliated her had transformed her into one of the most sought-after voices on workplace dignity and inclusion. Sofia Delgado had been promoted to gate supervisor at DFW with specific responsibility for implementing customer service improvements. Her courage in speaking up during the incident had made her a company role model, and she now trained new employees on recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior. Jonathan had become a prominent voice for corporate accountability, speaking at industry conferences and business schools about the importance of aligning company culture with stated values. The incident had changed him personally as well, making him more conscious of his own assumptions and more intentional about creating inclusive environments. Exactly 1 year after the incident, Dr. Brooks found herself back at DFW Airport flying to another conference. She had specifically requested to fly through the same terminal on the same airline as a personal test of how much had really changed. Gate B14 looked different now. The staff was more diverse, with a team that included people from multiple ethnic backgrounds and age groups. The training and culture changes were evident in the way employees interacted with passengers, respectful, professional, and genuinely welcoming regardless of who they were serving. Sofia Delgado was working the gate now, wearing the uniform of a supervisor rather than a junior agent. When she saw Dr. Brooks approaching, her face lit up with a smile of genuine warmth and recognition. Dr. Brooks. "It's wonderful to see you again. I hope you're having a much better travel experience today." "I am indeed," Dr. Brooks replied, handing over her boarding pass with a smile. "And I'm proud to see how far you've come, Sofia. You showed real courage that day." "I learned that courage matters more than keeping quiet," Sofia replied. "And Mr. Mitchell has created an environment where doing the right thing is supported rather than punished." As Dr. Brooks moved through the boarding process, she noticed other changes that reflected the deeper transformation Skybridge had undergone. A young black woman in a management training uniform was confidently directing passenger flow and solving problems. An older Hispanic man was training new gate agents with clear authority and respect from his colleagues. The diversity wasn't tokenistic or performative, it was integrated and natural. But the most meaningful moment came as she settled into her first-class seat. A young black woman in a crisp Skybridge uniform approached with professional confidence. "Good morning, Dr. Brooks. I'm Jennifer, your lead flight attendant today. On behalf of the entire crew, we're honored to have you aboard, Doctor." Brooks looked at Jennifer's confident bearing, her obvious competence, her unquestioned authority in her workspace. This was what success looked like, not just the absence of discrimination, but the presence of opportunity and respect for everyone willing to earn it. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Dr. Brooks reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation of being dragged from a boarding gate had been transformed into meaningful change that would benefit countless others. The pain of discrimination had become the catalyst for dignity. She thought about Linda Rodriguez and Frank Williams, whose careers had ended because of their inability to see her humanity. But more importantly, she thought about Sofia Jennifer and the many other employees who now worked in an environment where their worth was measured by their competence and character rather than their appearance. The promise of the boarding pass, once broken by prejudice, had been reforged stronger than before. Not just for her, but for everyone who would follow. The aircraft climbed into the clear Texas sky, carrying passengers who might never know how much safer and more respectful their journey had become, because of events that had unfolded 1 year earlier at this very gate. Dr. Brooks opened her laptop and began preparing for her presentation at the next conference. She had work to do, innovations to share, and minds to shape. But now she did that work knowing that the industry she served had taken meaningful steps toward treating every person who walked through its doors with the dignity they deserved. What began as a moment of deep humiliation at a boarding gate became a catalyst for transformation that rippled through an entire industry. It proved that one person's dignity, when defended with courage and conviction, can be more powerful than entrenched patterns of bias. The swift and decisive actions of a leader who remembered his roots turned a moment of crisis into a movement for lasting change. This wasn't just about one woman getting on one flight. It was about ensuring that the doors of opportunity remain open to everyone, and that no one ever has to prove they belong in a seat they have rightfully earned. If this story moved you and reminded you that respect and dignity should never be negotiable, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message of courage and transformation. And subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove justice and accountability can triumph over prejudice and discrimination. What did you think of the CEO's response? Have you ever witnessed discrimination that needed to be called out? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this important conversation about treating every person with the dignity they deserve. Together, we can make sure stories like Dr. Brooks's lead to positive change in our own communities and workplaces.